I'm in Stockholm, and it's sunny, like bright, endless sun. It's that time of year. It's a bit relentless.
We could probably start the conversation since everyone is online. We are delighted to present the fourth edition of Curators Conversation titled Curating Silence and Erasure with the curators Annie Fletcher, Natasha Marie Llorens, Radhika Hettiarachchi, Fatimah Hossaini, Jasmine Wahi, and Sadya Mizan. The panel will discuss curatorial approaches to absence, omission, and marginality.
Hi, I think it's on me. Okay, so I think I'm not going to say much really. I just wanted to show a few of the projects that I'm involved in or have been involved in the last 15 years to do with erasure and silence. I won't take too long. I was told 3 to 5 minutes. So some of you may know that we've had Sri Lanka's had a conflict, a 26-year conflict, an ethno-political war, and then 15 years since of very little reckoning with the difficult past and with the multiple narratives that are part of this war. Well, most of these projects basically look at combating the victors' way of telling the story or not telling the story of the vanquished. And these projects basically counter the danger of having a single narrative, which in Sri Lanka we did have, particularly in terms of obliteration or marginalization or forceful denial of other narratives that are outside of the victor's narrative, and the repetition of these the one narrative, the one single narrative, obviously has meant that the kind of violence that it pushes on forgetting and remembering has been quite severe. And the danger of this is obviously, when it's activated, what it can do in terms of people with vested interest and power. I think the question then for us is really about how we as a body politic try to question, challenge, and rectify, or at least present alternatives. I'll just briefly run through four of the projects that deal with this that I've been working on in the last 15 years. And one of them is the Her Stories project, which has 285 narratives that use verbal and non-verbal methodologies, particularly arts-based tools. And if the presentation comes up, you can see a brief glimpse of it. And the second project, and this was done immediately after the war when during a very triumphalist narrative that was being built up by the government. So at that time, the sort of the disproportionate effect on women of the war was not really heard. So this is a project that chose to feminize the narrative of war. And building on that is the Women's Histories of Sex Work, which basically happened a decade and something later. But it sort of captures some of the silences of the Her Stories project that were always referred to but remained unaddressed. So this one basically looks at two registers of women's histories of conflict, one being that of sex work during the conflict, particularly because there were these sex corridors that were created, possibly to maintain the heteronormativity of soldiers. And then there is the second aspect of it, which is the conflict-related sexual violence on sex workers. That's a hidden narrative that no one really talks about, not even in the discourses that are around human rights, because of the conflicting and uncomfortable way sex work sits within notions of motherhood, nationalism, womanhood, in a context like Sri Lanka. The third project is really something building up on the Her Stories project again, using these methodologies, and that's called Memory Map, and it's got 352 stories of women, children, men from villages and individuals. That again was something that we took around the island as a traveling exhibition, and it went, it was hanging on clotheslines or trees or schools, and it was basically inviting villagers to come and look at these stories, engage with them, and then share their own stories in storytelling circles through facilitated dialogue. And the final project, I think it was mentioned before, is a shared journeys, which is a 7-country exhibition that happened during COVID. And this one is really about all of these different institutions, about 12 different organizations, presenting various projects, arts or even dialogue projects that were really looking at challenging the dominant narratives and commonly held truths in those countries. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of some of these arts-based methodologies that we use, like trees of life, body mapping, memory maps of sites, videos, stories, like craft, like sari painting and other things, and stitching, various different methodologies that were used. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to share with you a few of the objects of memory that were shared throughout these projects. I mean, we've got hundreds of objects of memory, but some of these objects really share these deeply held and hardly visible truths that are very subjective. Inviting people to really think about what a democratized truth really looks like, because it's not just, for example, the camouflage shirt is not just war heroes, but it has personal connotations for individuals, both positive and negative. So it's an invitation really to look beyond the veil, and to sort of decolonize your mind from thinking about it a certain way, and all that. So all of these basically ask the questions of whether history is also perspective. It doesn't, it's more than just what is presented. So all of these different projects kind of tackle that aspect of combating the loss of narrative, really. So that's just a brief overview so that you'd know what I'm talking about when we do engage. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Radhika. It's very powerful projects, and it's so interesting and important. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. Alicia, could we perhaps share the next presentation?
Sadya would be sharing her screen.
Sure. Sadya, would you like to go ahead, please?
Yeah, so you can see the full screen, I hope. First of all, thank you for having me. I was more looking for, first we'll discuss and show examples, but let's start with this. The topic is very interesting, and I have only few projects to share out of the different things that I did. I think the theme is at the core of my practice as well. I kind of started curating to look at the things that are not being talked about or being neglected or really missing out. Is the screen changing or something? Prerna, can you confirm if you can see me?
We can see the presentation, Sadya.
Okay, great. So first project is Toronto Artist Community, which I started with my curatorial journey basically, and it kind of questions the art practice being or having no social connection to it. So when I was in the Fine Art Academy, I would look at others' practices, and it felt like this is neither talking about Bangladesh, this is neither talking about the current time, neither talking about the society. So why this detachment? And there is so many other narratives that is around, and it's not coming into the work. And on the other side, the reality was certain heritage sites in Bangladesh, which is in the rural. So in Bangladesh, which is out of capital, it's unseen, unspoken, neglected, abandoned. But those rural areas and those heritage places are basically the cultural roots, which was getting neglected, and for vandalism, it's getting lost. So basically, we were kind of in a situation where we are rootless. We don't connect to cultural roots. We don't have a culture of archiving properly, because our histories has been always written by others, by our colonizers. So it seemed very problematic. So I put together two of the problems or gaps together, where these places were losing visuals and the oral histories were getting lost, which are our roots. And then artists not really connecting with the cultural roots or the local narrative. So putting them together, we created this platform where we take artists to the heritage sites, and they have to work on the oral histories of those sites. So when I say heritage sites and their current realities are something like this, I'll just show you some visual so that you can get an idea. So we go to this kind of areas which are really not counted as important or any part of any authority's concern. And we put together certain methodologies to efficiently archive these things and motivate in societal art practices, or use art as a social tool. In that case, the first method that we put together was site responsive. So it and generally neglected and invisible in Muslim extremist society or patriarchic society, like in Bangladesh. Communities' skills, craft, these are getting lost. So different things came into the discussion, into the expressions that artists created, and all this thing was happening within the community. And that burning question we often talk about in community projects: are we giving with the, or are we creating this with the community, or giving the community, or we are extracting from them? So that's where also we wanted to work in methodologies, that the stories that are being getting lost, how do we preserve it within the community rather than just extracting? Because that's another way of supporting it getting lost. Because when we extract, or city people go and extract it, they don't have any more connection with that. The community does not have it. So how we balance that? So we do all the things on the site, like this one site, and this was the archive photo that we found out from the local community people, and this is the current realities. And it sometimes turns out into a scroll painting, into a pop-up book, which allows it to live within that community and also other communities beyond the location. This is just a glimpse of how it is community inclusive, and the way of keeping alive the soon-to-be-lost histories and cultural roots was to keep it alive within the community, not someone else from outside going and becoming an authority for that. So that was Uranto Artist Community. And we started as 2012, and we did until COVID hit. And then since COVID, we kind of, because social distancing was not something we could really put together here in such kind of inclusive project. So we took a pause, and we will revive again maybe next year. The other history, which has been a trial of erasure of certain communities' identity, is the Rohingya Cultural Memory Center, where I was affiliated as the facilitator for them. It's a project under the UN IOM, International Organization for Migration. And this is a project about the cultural heritage and histories of the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And their identity, their existence was neglected. They were not, they were stateless, they were identityless. In such condition, this project was being shaped under the mental health department, if I say, because they were suffering from this trauma of losing their identity. And to help them heal from that, or give them a sense of belonging, the first thing we looked into is preserving their identity, cultural identity and heritage. So this was the center. The picture that you can see is within the refugee camp. This is the refugee camp. Within that, the center was, where I was working with the community closely for 3 years during the COVID. And in such kind of communities, which is even more extremist in religious belief, women are not allowed to come out and they have to cover themselves. A major part of the history gets missed out when you work on archive because women are not counted in the discussion. So that's where I was focusing on the histories or oralities that women bring in. They are upbringing the children, they are keeping the family alive and other things, and their memories, their narratives are never getting counted. So focusing on that, and again trying to sustain the process of surviving their own culture and heritage, I wanted to use their tools rather than introducing new tools to them, and I wanted to use their skill set. So women came with the skill set of embroidery, and which was making them appear in their work, and their memories, not only their narrative was becoming the visual of their memories, but also was contributing in knowledge sharing, intergenerational exchange, and different ways it was contributing. Like this piece that represents the women who I was working with, and their photos are not allowed to be published online. You're not allowed to take their photos. They're not allowed to show their faces. But through their embroidery, they could bring themselves out and show how they work together, how they live together, how they look and dress, and what kind of memories and dreams they have. Like this work represents their current life in the refugee camp. So different camp, different activities, different lifestyle, what logistic exists, everything was archived through their work. And this is a work on the farming culture, or Rohingya farming culture with the farming tools. So in the camp, which is a protective crisis now, the usual duration of protective crisis is 22 years. So the children that are born in the camp, they grow adult within the camp without knowing anything about their farming culture or fishing culture, because there is no space for that. And this kind of work by the women becomes the knowledge of their cultural practices or farming cultures and in visuals. So that's a brief about the Rohingya Cultural Memory Center. And the third one and the last one that I want to briefly talk about is the 36th July, which is about the student movement that happened in Bangladesh last year in July and continued until August 5th. So that's why the revolution was a student movement. For those who don't have the whole idea about the revolution, it was a quota movement in the government job, and it has been going on for many years. Since 2013, the demands have been placed to the government, and then it was never really acknowledged or addressed, and nothing changed. And it became a solid revolution or movement of student in 2024. And then it just got heated up by the negligence of the government authorities, killing of innocent students overnight, and all unethical movements just heated it up, and it just turned out larger than it actually started with. And then the movement ended up kind of getting the prime minister out of the country. It really brought a change, but then that has also current consequences. But what this 36 July project was looking at is, since we know that there is always surveillance on online materials or what our spoken words, we don't have a freedom of speech in the country. So everything can be erased of the revolution and all the works that was being published online. So this is the beginning of the movement, and this is what was happening around, which was not really coming out properly in the news, or people were not really allowed to publish much things. But artists in different mediums, especially digital mediums, they were coming out strong with their voices, and that also worried the government. And then they put a surveillance and internet shutdown and total country shutdown of all network happened, and even that came into artist work. And then we felt the urge to archive such kind of narratives, because these are the real narratives which was not shown anywhere else, and which was being under suppressed, and government tried to suppress them. And then so collecting all this work, we turned it into a living archive in a form of exhibition. All this narrative, when the internet shutdown was happening, the government put full shutdown on internet. All the movement became turned into walls. Every surface in the country was a canvas. So we archive all those things. So all these different mediums of expression, creative expression, from photography, digital work, illustration, cartoon, graffiti, everything was, we created an archive and we created a timeline of 36 days, each day, how it changed and how it got ignited and what came at the end, what was the result of it, the long march to the PM's house, and PM was forced to leave the country, and all this. So it turned into an archive, a timeline archive, which we call the living archive. We just don't want to call it an exhibition. And we designed the archive or the exhibition as a portable, because anyone can just do this exhibition anywhere if they have a printer. So we didn't want it to have like framed artwork or anything, because we want it to be very easily portable. So these are basically the basics of the project, some other views. And we also put some of the display in a public window gallery, which wanted to break through the conceptual classical understanding of museum, but as a more public accessible window. So that's the display of that. So I should stop here now. I'm looking forward for the discussion. Then I can give more detail.
Thank you so much, Sadya. I think we also have a brief presentation to share. And Sadya, very interestingly, I think many years back I was into documentary filmmaking. So I did cover the Rohingya refugee crisis very extensively, along with the Kashmir political crisis. It's a lifetime ago, but yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about that. I'll just briefly share the PDF, since we are anyway running short on time. So as a gallery, as you all know, we are a gallery which is based in Bombay, in Colaba. As a space, we have had multiple exhibitions which are on the lines of the topic today. So one of the exhibitions which I'd like to share is called Lament Traces, which was can you see my screen? Yeah, all right, okay. This is the installation view of Lament Traces. The show was basically about artistic practices that respond to systems of oppression and manipulation. They were attuned to trauma, memory, and shifting political currents. Especially with the political situation today in India, I think this exhibition was very important. The show was about unearthing layers of colonization, casteism, economic disparity, racism, and ideological dominance embedded within the social fabric. These are just some of the works. So for instance, this artist's work is about a marginalized community, especially when it comes to rubber tappers. Another installation view. This of course works by Ram Rahman, which probe into historical events, and this is another view of his work. Smadul Jaya's work, which talks about censorship. Work from Meher Afroz. It's another installation view. This is another exhibition which we had, which was titled My Peking Red Brass Strap, which talks about the cultural politics of concealment and visibility around the female body. I think that's something we all have seen in different places. So these were some of the works from the show. Lastly, we had an exhibition called Metaphors for Land, and it's a brief installation view of that. I'm probably just going to keep this the presentation short, because we're really running short on time, and I'd love to hear from all the speakers, and have the discussion. So perhaps I'll just open the conversation with a question. Erasure often implies a forceful act, that of removing, denying, or rewriting. Can you share a project where you had to contend with erasure, be it institutional, political, or personal, and how that shaped your curatorial choices? Would anyone like to take that, please?
Yeah, okay, maybe I'll jump in if that's okay.
Please do.
I mean, yeah, it's a great question, and I'm really so delighted to be part of this conversation. So thank you so much, and can't wait to keep discussing. I suppose, I mean, it's not a particular example, but it probably informs very much the practice that I'm developing now in the Irish Museum of Modern Art. And I would say that the erasure that I saw very visibly, I worked for 25 years basically within Europe, and we were watching. I'm old enough to remember the explosion of the kind of global art world beyond its old sort of sedimented ideas, and the excitement post fall of the wall, but also the industry, of course, of the neoliberal art world. But what I did not see at all within that global practice of biennials was any Irish practice. And this isn't to talk about being in any way essentialist or nationalist, but it was a very interesting time, if you're talking the early 90s, post and even the grappling with things like the Gulf War and issues for the first time of kind of the military industrial complex were being articulated within the language of kind of those shows, and thinking about securitocracy. And those were all things that were being developed in quite a sophisticated manner by Irish practice, especially from the north of Ireland, but I wasn't seeing it. And it's one of the things that, since I came back to Ireland, I think it's completely defined why I'm very interested in these kind of topics. And on one level, it's to do with the idea of not only the active erasure and censorship of a lot of this practice from 68.
Oh, Annie, your screen
onwards in Ireland.
Your screen froze there. We lost you there for a second. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I suppose what I wanted to talk about was what I was seeing as a dual effect of not only a censorship from Britain, but an active sense of self-censorship. And I think that's quite interesting, and is in relation to this idea of the history of the victors, but also a kind of shame of colonization, or a shame of political collapse. And they're things that really inform me now. I'm kind of obsessed with trying to think about how do we articulate and compare these hidden histories, or these fractured histories, with others in a confident way. So it's about building a kind of capacity in a post-political collapse. And what does that possibility lead us to? So I guess it's more the experience of that kind of erasure, I would say, more informs what I'm trying to develop now. And just to give you a very quick example of what that erasure felt like. Brexit is a great example. There was zero knowledge in Britain among a very sophisticated art world about the damage and the political precarity that Brexit was going to bring to the status of Northern Ireland, and even the possibility of reactivating the war. And I think for a lot of my contemporaries in London, they were shocked at how little their colleagues knew about Northern Ireland as a result. Either this very dangerous sort of development, and yet they professed to know a lot about kind of the global practice of the world. So there was something really interesting about how effective Britain had been at erasing this practice. So to that end, I'm working with an artist called Isabel Harbison, our curator, who's based in Goldsmiths, on a huge oral history of mainly women and collectives in Northern Ireland who are working with film and video in kind of a more activist sort of manner. And they were commissioned, and one particular show we did recently was the Derry Film and Video Collective. And this work was 30 years old. And we did an exhibition of it recently, which was fantastic. And it's now traveling the world. There's an appetite for it now in a way that wasn't at the time. And it was interesting because they were commissioned by actually Channel 4 in the same way as the Black Audio Visual Collective and many others. But they were continuously censored and raided. And this is not a history that Britain wants to talk about now. So I think Ireland, and we are in the driving force is to build the capacity and the safe space to speak about this and to reckon with this. But the second point is our own self-censorship, our own ability to buy into that sort of the victor's narrative and subjugate other possible narratives. And so to that end, we're developing a project called the Technologies of Peace, because I think the Irish experience 25 years into a peace process, it's there's something very interesting happening now that is very noisy and exciting. And I think it's a kind of cultural intelligence that develops when one understands what is at stake in a state of political precarity. And so I'm trying to think about that in comparison to other places and spaces. So yeah, maybe there are two examples.
Radhika, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, to sort of, I mean, if were there other presentations or
No, I think that's about it. Because yeah.
Okay, sorry. Well, no, I was just sort of, I wanted to pick up on something you were talking about, the aspect of self-censorship. It's something that it's when I was doing the work with the sex workers and documenting their narratives using body maps and things like that. So they document themselves basically. Most of these body maps are with them. And then we use the same conversations, different conversations to actually talk, use video or something like that. And then a different aspect of an emotive self would emerge. But, they have their original body maps with them. But what I was thinking about when you were saying that was the conflict-related sexual violence that they had encountered, they thought was part of the job, rather than something that is outside of transactional sex work. So it's ingrained to such a level that the self-censoring happens because you assume that your story doesn't matter, because the larger conversation, it sort of marginalizes that anyway, and what happens in the shadows. But so that was like one point that I wanted to share with you about that. And the second thing when you were talking that I was thinking about is that with us, with the Sri Lankan conflict, immediately after the conflict, there were so many monumentalizing projects of memory, large pins and that popping up everywhere, mostly state-sponsored, the victor's narrative, right? But what was interesting about that is that there were also opportunities that other organizations, civil society organizations, gave to communities to erect their own monuments if they wanted to. And one of the conversations really struck me, which is in APRE, which is a very sort of remote area. And so we were working with the community, as you were saying, Sandhya, like producing work that was staying in the community. So talking to them about how they wanted to remember something like 50 people that died in that location during the war, as in not just died, actually brutally and violently died. And it was interesting because the community were talking to each other about how they could do this, but still get what they wanted out of it, which was a water tank. What they wanted was a water tank for their community because they were really like, the effects of the war meant that they didn't have water, right? And here was these people coming with money for a memory project. And so they were like, okay, so what if we build a water tank with this and put the names of these people on it? So it was a really interesting way for this idea of monumentalizing memory and then working around it. When you're working with people, because in a sense that the idea of, it was really a stark reminder to me, at least, that, in monumentalizing memory, you're crystallizing one narrative, right? Even if it's a community narrative. And that in that process of consensus building to develop this one memorial, they themselves are eliminating marginal memorials to come up with this one thing that makes sense to them as a community now, not when they were actually experiencing or having this lived experience, but based on the needs of today. So in a sense, it was really interesting to see that for them, that, all of this purported, these ideas of sort of closure, things that this group was bringing to their community, they weren't really interested in that. So for them, healing was something that was personal, that was going to take years and years and years. And this crystallized memory wasn't going to do that for them. And it made me think about the fact that oral history, traditionally, at least for us, was fluid, right? It moves from generation to generation. It changes perhaps as memory fades and people change. But in trying to enable people to develop community-based memorials that they have to now think about, actually almost is a disservice, at least in that context for me, because it actually broke the fluidity of memory. It made them crystallize memory in that moment and keep it like that, which I think bears a certain violence, because you're actually ripping that element of fluidity out of it. So anyway, just some thoughts, but some things I was thinking about when you were speaking about it, and my own experiences. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, because I think what's very interesting then is to understand that curating can be tactical, and that you're understanding the multiple use of the piece. That there's actually like several registers under as to how it's functioning in order to unleash capacity, rather than indeed a kind of a violence of symbology that's actually, just sedimenting something. So I think I often think about curating as cultural hijack. So I'm very interested in all these ways of how do you mobilize and stage the encounter in an appropriate and non-violent way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think Sadya, you have a comment.
I just want to add, we have also similar experiences in community where they would just say, maybe a toilet, maybe a school, maybe something else. Mm-hmm. I think also connecting to Anna's talk, that the main erasure or the silencing is everywhere in Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. There is no art policy. There is no archiving culture. There is no art magazine. I mean, I'm just talking from the art and culture practice, because that's where I am trying to contribute and I'm working. There is no museum culture. So how do you preserve? So when we talk about erasure and silencing, how do you unsilence things? Preserving, presenting, talking about it, those are not there. You talk about something in magazine, you talk about something through the policy, you demand something that's not existing. You preserve something, museums are not existing. There is no archival culture. As I said, since our history has been written by our colonizers, it never was revived by we write our history. And that's the learning I put in the Rohingya project, where we wanted them to write their history rather than we telling them what to write. So that's the struggle I had in my curatorial practice. And as Anna said, like, it's anything but curation, I guess, like the so-called curation that we talk about. It's like, for me, it's always finding a composition of different gaps, different challenges, different narrative. How do you kind of balance it in a composition? You never can make everyone happy, obviously not. And I think I always come back from the community project having 10% of guilt, like, could we do things a little better or something? That's always there, I think. Still, it's a discussion of all the methodologies. And I still think we are not able to address all the silences, but we're just trying.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Sadya. Jasmine, Natasha, Fatima, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you, Prerna. I just want to say that you bring amazing, wonderful ideas here, because Annie shared her own experience, and another side, Sadya, another side, Radhika. So, I mean, of course, I came from the concept that this geopolitical conflict and always this erasing and absence exists both in the place that I was born and grew up, Iran, and also originally from Afghanistan. And also, I just saw, to be honest, another side of it when I became a refugee in France. And now I'm seeing another side of it, even in New York, as an immigrant. So I think in every steps that we just walk in, it doesn't matter that it's Afghanistan or Bangladesh or it's America or France. So like the same thing Annie said about the Brexit, because that caused that I couldn't finish a project that I had with Guardian, because in that time I couldn't get UK visa. It's 2 hours from Paris, but I mean, Brexit stuff, So, I think especially we as a woman, if you put it in gender, or if you I mean, it all depends on who you are, what are you doing, and sometimes, to be honest, Sadya, it's not just about your country. Because when I was working in Kabul, I had my own challenges as an Afghan. Again, as an Afghan who was born and grew up in Iran, that they saw me that I'm not even that much connected to the concept of Afghanistan, and how I dare to talk about that. So it was in another kind of being erased, or misrepresent. I really like the last question of how you manage it with us, Prerna, that you said that sometimes it's not just about the erase, but also through absence of the or mispresenting. So I just saw it in another way in France, that how they put me in a box of being a refugee, or always talk about a work of exile. And I'm so thankful for you to bringing this platform that we can talk about it very openly, because the concept of my works in Afghanistan was just the absence of this victimization, to just show my photos in the women of Afghanistan in a more powerful and resilient way. But it just put me in another kind of being erased, that when you are an artist from Afghanistan, was born in Iran and came from a geopolitical conflict zone, so you are just allowed to talk in this context, and you are erased from being open to discuss about your works in other topics. So I think we always, in any nationality and all around the world, from everywhere, just facing different kind of being erased or misrepresent. And also it depends on all of us, as Sadya said, that how we rewrite and fight for present ourselves in the right way.
Thanks so much, Fatima. Jasmine, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, I think to sort of riff off that, this idea of boxing sort of marginalized or historically marginalized or othered identities into particular boxes that are both legible and reductive to the white gaze. And I guess that's perhaps relative to a sort of an American phenomenon, where the idea here is that everyone who is not heterosexual and white is automatically othered. That has been sort of my experience as a life experience and professional experience, and professionally something I try to combat as a curator. But it's really fighting an uphill battle, because there is, I think, a constant external pressure to be boxed and to think in an anti-intersectional way, although I think that's changing a little bit, anti-intersectional or reductive or flat way. And I think to the idea of self-censorship, there's also an element of maybe not censorship or self-erasure, which is a phenomenon, and one that I really understand, particularly in light of what's been happening here over the past few months. But also, I think a type of tailoring or acquiescing, both for artists and curators, to what is expected for the aesthetics of, insert particular marginalized groups. So, like, thinking about what queer aesthetics are, or what aesthetics of Blackness are, or the aesthetics of immigrant aesthetics. And so something that I'm interested in is, how do we combat that without stripping away our own histories and art histories, without capitulating to an expectation that is predominantly based on Western art histories. And I think to echo Fatima, it's very, very difficult, because no matter where you go, whether it's this country or elsewhere, there's an automatic expectation of what you should be doing and what you should be making and how you should be making it and who you should be making it. for. And I think that's sort of the last part of what I'm thinking about more recently in a query I have for both artists and curators, and I think cultural makers writ large, is who is the work that you are making for. And of course, it can be for more than one person. It can be coded on multiple levels. But I think as a sort of primary query, that is perhaps what a lot of us should be thinking about as makers. Because otherwise we're constantly, I think, and perhaps unconsciously or subconsciously, working within, and obviously it's a very generalized statement, but working within a framework of expectation that already exists.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for a thought. Natasha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting conversation. There's a lot of resonance. I'm just going to drop something in the chat. This is a show I made with my partner, Anna Dasovic, who's an artist who was based in Amsterdam for a long time before she moved to Sweden with me, where we're both based. And I think I introduce it in this context because I think it responds to a lot of things that have been said, that this is a show about genocide. And it's a show about the genocide of Bosnian Muslims in the 90s. And the legacy of that trauma. And one of the conversations that was really important to us as we were making this show was in the Netherlands, which had a peacekeeping force as part of the UN deployment to the former Yugoslavia. The Dutch were essentially responsible for a sort of a territory that fell, and many people were massacred as a result of their irresponsibility. And there's a lot of like public self-flagellation in the Netherlands as a result of this failure. But the thing that gets erased is something that gets erased in a lot of contexts in which white people misbehave. And that is the long aftermath, the traumatic aftermath for those who are still there. Yeah. And the narrative gets told as the sort of burden, the historical burden of the Dutch soldiers, the things that they suffered as a result of being forced to be complicit with this genocide, all of the things that they felt, and yet there is little complex aesthetic attention, especially in the Netherlands, to these other experiences that are evolving, that are not static historical experiences of trauma. And it was really interesting within this show, we invited somebody who works at the military college in the Netherlands on the basis of previous work with archives that she'd done. And she introduced into the show this controversy. She wanted to show archives of snapshots taken by Dutch soldiers, and the narrative around why include these snapshots and how to contextualize them in an exhibition that was essentially about the experience of violence of Bosnian Muslims and not Dutch bed soldiers, was one of the major frictions in the exhibition itself. How to rebalance the equation, and I just feel like that form of erasure, just like less. It's not authoritarian exactly. It's not state sponsored the way it would be in other contexts in which I work a lot. It's not the result of like a really violently polarized conversation like what I experienced in the US and in France. But there is like something really at stake in the focus, in the shift of attention, in the funding and the projects and the research and the articles and the way that we pay attention to those things. That I think is a really vicious form of erasure and silencing. Yeah, and this was just a project that I thought might contribute to the conversation in that sort of afterlife, or what happens in the long game.
I'll probably ask the next question, which is how do you approach the notion of absence, whether as a subject, a strategy, or a condition?
I'll share one example because I shared with Alicia this image from this book of women's histories that put together called We Are Present. I don't know, Alicia, if you have it, or I'm not very good at sharing these screens, but I'll try and find it if I can. Or do you have it, Alicia? Okay, I'll share with you now. Okay, so one of the one of the projects that there we go. One of the projects that I was doing was something called We Are Present: Women's Histories of Conflict, Courage, and Survival, and this one was really about revisiting people that I had worked with 10 years before that. So the idea was that, what we were talking about earlier, Annie, about the fluidity and the problematic nature of capturing oral histories. So I thought of revisiting the same people 10 years later and having them look at what they produced with the idea that, do you still stick to that narrative or do you correct your own record, sort of. And it was really interesting. And this is one of the ways in which I chose to visualize it, because it's visualizing absence as a presence. So she's still present in the archive in her absence, but she wanted her entire work removed from the archive, which is her right, and it was withdrawn and online or in the National Archives, which is where my projects are. If you go in, and that won't be there anymore. But I still wanted to visualize that absence by sort of scratching well, redacting it, and still sort of presenting that with the idea that we actually need to look at absence and presence as something that is truly the right of the individual. Like it's really about memory and forgetting, in a sense, not so much even in like dichotomies of like remembering and forgetting, but almost looking at it as a spectrum of still wanting to remember but not wholly remember, but still being present in that absence. So I mean, in terms of curating that, it was a difficult conversation that I was having with myself, because it's certainly her right to not be represented, but it was this idea that we still need to talk about her story. It was a really powerful story in that sense of rape and being a teenager that actually took the perpetrators to court during the war. So it was a story of courage that is very rare in Sri Lanka. So it was one of those stories that I was loath to remove because it was so powerful. So the only way to really have that conversation but still blur the boundaries of what that absence meant was to present it like this. So I just wanted to share that. But I guess in a way it's looking at absence as a constant presence, really.
Yeah, I'm struck by that question, because I feel like the thing that is the most haunting absence at the moment is the absence to come, like the way that we are slowly being sort of closed in to context, and that mobility is becoming more difficult, not just during COVID, but in its aftermath, and with the rise of like I don't know, the sense that COVID showed us that the borders can close easily and quickly and definitively, and that is a testament to how it will be produced again, and that the absence that we experienced as exceptional during COVID is actually like a taste of something that will come, and I mourn that absence in advance. The absence of my colleagues, the absence of spaces to gather and exchange. That's the sense that I have.
Thanks, Natasha. I think, Jasmine, you have a comment.
Sorry, there's a large cat outside and my dogs are going crazy. so you might not be able to hear me that well, but I was just going to comment on this idea of mobility becoming harder. I would even argue that the ability to move, physically move, and I think that's trickled out into restrictive dialogues and cross-cultural or intersectional dialogues actually began, at least here, even though I think one would also argue it preceded it, with as far back within our generation as 9/11, as the sort of starting point, particularly for Black and brown people. And I guess I can only really speak in the context of this country, but that type of reduction and censorship and mobility started almost 25 years ago.
And do you feel the absence that is produced by those restrictions?
I do. I think there was a moment of pushback against it, and then really a normalization of, there was a pushback in as much as there was an effort to create visibility within Muslim, Black and brown communities for a time. And then that was sort of there was a rollback on that. And then we saw a further rollback, I guess, I would say in 2016, perhaps. And now we're seeing sort of a resurgent reaffirmation, and I think perhaps in a much more violent, physically violent, and intellectually violent way now again, and not just because of our current political administration, but more as a cultural shift. And I do think you're right. I think that something happened, understandably, during COVID as a very present health crisis, that then translated into a type of political conservatism that really, again, reaffirmed this inability to move, and I guess, frankly, be safe in a lot of ways. And there's so many other factors to that, of course, but I think there has been a rampant I guess anti-white rhetoric that started as far back as, or really ramped up as far back as 20-something years ago. And then there are these sort of blips in history, in recent history, that accelerate that and further affirm it. October 7th being one, and we're seeing sort of the continuous fallout of rhetoric on Palestine being erased, sometimes violently.
Thanks, Jasmine. So it also sort of reminds me during my, if you're talking about censorship, during my documentary days, I remember, we didn't have a large crew at that time. It was just me and another person carrying the camera. So once we were sort of covering this massive protest with stone pelting and tear gas shelling and everything, and I still remember that one of the people there thought that I'm with the mainstream Indian media, and started beating me with a log, saying that you Indian journalists show our narrative in such a twisted manner. We really do not want you here. So that sort of, for me, that was that really made me question a lot of what we see in the local newspapers and local media. For me, that was this was many years back, but that for me was the first sort of wake up call. Yeah. I'll probably move on to the next question, which is how do you work with archives and or the lack of them?
So, Prerna, I just want to say something about this archives that I'm working. So, I mean, it's quite crazy because in Afghanistan concepts and context, archives, unfortunately, because of the civil wars and all these 40 years of being colonized and everything, very like a big part of it destroyed or distorted by war and political agendas. But in the context of Afghanistan, I think I just tried to find another kind of life. Living archive, So rooted in the history. So that's why when I was in Kabul before the collapse of Republic and before Taliban took over, I used to travel to the provinces and see the women, interview them, and also they were just like showing their family photos to me. And still I'm collecting those family photos after the migration from Afghans in US, Afghans in Europe, in Iran, in Pakistan, everywhere. So the thing is that whatever I wanted to mention is that sometimes in the context of the countries, like for example, I am just like seeing another friend from Palestine and from Syria, that they are also working on some kind of other archiving of photos in another way, as I'm a photographer. But also regarding the other works that I'm doing with archives, I also want to mention that as much as you have access sometimes to some information and some archives, you can find more documents of the histories that's also documented, Now, after the collapse, that I cannot have access anything anymore to Afghanistan photos, families, photos, anything. So I started my project in Silk Road, in the borders of Afghanistan, which is going to the new Silk Road and end up to North Africa. And it was nice that I find some archives from the Middle East photos and Central Asian, and some magazines and newspapers from Afghanistan during 17th at the New York Public Library and Metropolitan, and also some universities. But it's still, even the archives, you see the lack of something, sometimes, I just wanted to see women photographers as subject and also as photographers. But there are some countries that, I don't know, something is missing about them, and you can't find, especially from Central Asia, you cannot find that much accessible archives. That's why I just wanted to mention it, that in the context that I'm working, sometimes even archive doesn't help me to find my answers, So that's why I go through the real and living archives.
Thanks a lot, Fatima, which also actually, just as a reflection, I don't know how reliable archives really are as well, it depends on, Sadya, you had a comment. You're on mute.
I was saying that I can talk all day of this frustration of existing archive and non-existing archives. So while Fatima was saying, before I forget, I was kind of pointing out, obviously, first oral archive. Obviously, there's no existing proper archive. So first oral archive, especially in terms of the Project Uronto, the histories and narratives of those places are really not archived. So we have to rely on generations and legacies and oral archive. So first oral archive, but the second step parallelly is keep asking. It's not that you ask one person, you'll get the right thing. Keep asking. That's the main problem. We just get one narrative. We think, oh, that's the data I have. That's the information I put it. So keep asking. That's the more important thing. Keep asking. And then question the existing narrative. Always question. I think that's where my curatorial practice started, because I was doubting all the art history book in the academy. We were just having one big fat book, history of art, all European history, every artist ending up having a blue period because we'd read a lot of Picasso and everything. That was frustrating. That's where I decided to be a curator. So question and argue with the existing archive, and investigate the method of those archives. Who did it? In what period? Who supported it? Where was it published? Where was it preserved? All this thing, if you question, you know whether you can trust it or not. Question the understanding of archive. I have been questioning this since 2019 in my question. How do you archive? I was going to, art residencies, because Uronto is the first residency, proper residency that we started, and nobody was willing to support us and everything. So sustainability became a question. And we were talking about archive. I went to Europe, South Africa, different countries. I was asking, how do you archive this? 70% of the answer was, I put it in website. Is that an archive? Does that make you accessible? Does that give you the proper access? So talk about the understanding of archive before even you start archiving. That's one thing. And be clear about your position when you're working with archive. Are you biased? Are you supporting someone? What are you doing? Self-realization, self-clarity is biggest thing again. Or it's this full circle, life comes in full circle, that you're biased, you're doing an archive, it stays problematic, and someone else has to question. So all these elements, it's just parallel. You have to look at all of them if you really want to work with archive and you want to, work with the lack of the archive, I think.
Thank you so much, Sadya. Radhika, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up from what Sadya was actually saying. I mean, in my own experience, and one of the things that we didn't actually have a lot of women's histories, and there were a few projects that were done, but from my practice is very much around the gender politics and the sort of the missing narratives. And so one of the things that for us was important was to actually co-create the archives ourselves, which is where all of these projects comes in, because it's not necessarily filling a gap, because that sounds like, it's not necessarily that, but it is actually just what you were saying, questioning and asking about the legitimacy and the authority and the authenticity of what's available, and producing our own, which are stories that we tell each other and document, basically. But I wanted to add to that when, in part of this practice, what was really interesting is that not to actually look at the archive or an exhibition out of the archive as an end product, which is what we have tried not to do, which is to actually look at the whole thing as part of a process. And then it becomes really a part of a tool set that we have used in our memory activism, which is really a political struggle. So, and once you start doing it, and once you start documenting and having people partake and really get into it, it actually has synergies with other political movements and the dynamism of the entire ecosystem. And in that way, there's a sort of an afterlife of the storytelling, afterlife of the archiving process that lives on in that kind of activism. And in a way, it really becomes a frontier between like state and civil society engagement, which is really sort of quite cool to discover as you continue on your path. It's been like 15 years, and then you see these synergies developing, and it's really, really quite wonderful, because so that's why I'm saying that there really isn't an end product of an archive. It just keeps going. And the question for me with that has really come up over the last 15 years is that of consent, really, about who has the authority to actually be part of it, and how accessible is it for the people in the archive to come back and withdraw. And so I've tried to do that in my work, really have that space to withdraw, so that archive becomes something that holds iterative consent, that you can keep coming back and doing it. But it's not easy when you think about from a records keeping point of view, or managing archives, and accessibility is just not easy. The other thing that was really interesting for me to discover in my own practice is, when I started out, I was really thinking about making sure that every side is represented, that there is the balance to the archive. But over time, talking to people themselves and about the disproportionate way in which violence has affected people's lives, at least in Sri Lanka, for me, it's really quite clear that neutrality is actually something that we do need to critique, because in a way, neutrality in the archive is actually a disservice, because it doesn't it doesn't represent the kind of violent traumas and silencing that some have encountered more than others. So opening up an archive to this kind of accessibility where people can consciously continue to highlight the power and privilege that actually comes into producing an archive is something that I think is quite crucial. I have no answers of how to do it. I mean, the only thing we've done is keep opening it up for correcting the record, but it's not perfect. And I have no answers, but it was something that I've been mulling over quite a bit. Thank you.
Sadya, you have a comment?
No, I just want to agree to that. I think that's where I pointed out the process that we have to question the understanding of archiving. I mean, this concept of archive and museum is highly problematic for me. Everything has to be dead and then it goes to museum, it goes to archive. Archive thing has to be a dark, serious chamber of boxes and packets and things, which is hard to navigate. We really have to question it. That's what is killing archival tendencies or potential of archives. And that can be a whole, itself a whole large discussion. But I truly agree with that archive we have to more look into living archives. That brings in lots of challenges to do it when you deal with different kind of difficult histories like this. But that's what I want to put on the floor, that maybe Prerna can do another session with other interesting minds about this.
Sure.
But thank you, Sadya, just mentioning it. I just want to put another comment that actually it's so crazy because there are some archives that they choose that who can see those archives, so they are not public for everyone have access, because I'm a researcher and visiting scholar, so I went through the school, but I had another friend came from Germany and she did everything to see the Afghanistan archive at the New York Library and she couldn't, So it's also very crazy that you're right. You have to question that why specific people can have access to see that. Thank you.
Thanks, Fatimah. Jasmine, I think you have a comment. You're on mute, Jasmine.
It's going to sound a little funny, but I think there are two or three things that I see as very sort of like simple solutions to the question of archiving as first steps. One is to, I think, encourage institutions, which frankly, institutions writ large, frankly, operate on what I would consider to be a colonial and capitalist system, which is why they're so restrictive about who is able to access particular archives. So encouraging open source archives, and in places where there are restrictive archives, simply taking what you can from them if you have access and then disseminating them broadly. And then I think the other thing is really making clear and upfront in when one is accessing archives, what the authorship, who the author is, and what the context of that is, and putting simply a disclaimer that archives are living and ongoing, because we're always discovering new histories and perspectives, and that there is no such thing as objectivity when it comes to history. And so being very clear about the vantage point of the author or authors. And then this is sort of the part that sounds a little funny, but archiving the archive. And that can be as simple as, again, a disclaimer about this particular archive is through the lens of this particular history and biases, and it exists with that caveat as something that we can reference as we create more or less hegemonic histories, as we create pluralistic histories. We should be thinking about archives not as a static singular lens, but ones that have one moment. If you're looking at one moment in time, it should be a general practice to look at least 6 different perspectives, which obviously creates so much more work, but I think it's important to have a pluralism of ideas to really understand histories and moments with a sort of 360 or well-rounded understanding of them.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I think, Natasha, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak from the Algerian context, which is one that I have, it's the context I work in the most. And it's a context in which there are colonial archives that are not accessible to anyone, including Algerians. The one that I think is really interesting, and this was there's a project by an Algerian artist named Dennis Martinez who deals with this explicitly, brings this archiving practice to life, and it's a system of overlapping drawings that are made on the interior walls of the collective meeting spaces in the High Atlas Mountains by the Amazigh people that have been doing this for thousands of years. And it's sort of like a layered mark making practice that can be read, although never masterfully, by successive generations. And I just think, I think this speaks to your point, Sadya, about...
Annie, do you have anything to add? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm loving this conversation. I mean, I think what we're talking about is an incredibly dynamic practice, right? And an iterative one and a questioning one that's really interrogating both the inadequacies and the roles of the museum. I mean, you know, Emma is hilarious in some ways because I am literally at the belly of the beast, right? I'm the Irish Museum of Modern Art. It couldn't be more institutional. And so it's kind of really fascinating to to try and pull out that more playful possibility or that rigorous interrogation. It also means that curating becomes speculative in a really good and inquiring way, which is a much more dynamic way to work and hopeful, as you say, Natasha. I mean, one of the things, so the museum is from 1864. It was the first soldier retirement home for soldiers of empire. So you're talking about a global colonial construct of the British. Previously, it was the Knights of Malta were there. So it's always been a global site. It's always been a strategic site. So when somebody mentioned earlier the idea of site responsiveness, I think that's a really lovely term and another way to think very dynamically. So right now I'm commissioning a book which sort of tries to deploy a lot of these speculative and multi-perspectival sort of questions to read the site as a material object in a way. Which of course is sending some of the art historians into paroxysms of, you know, that's not what you're for. And the people who love the military history don't particularly like that I'm mixing it all up, or we're mixing it all up as well. So there's lots of ways to generate the archive, right? It's I think it's the DNA of what a dynamic practice could be. I think it's really exciting to hear all the ideas.
Thanks, Annie. Jasmine, I think you have a comment. You're on mute.
Sorry, there's a lot of dog activity in the background. I just wanted to comment on what Annie was saying and clarify that I don't think museums we should get rid of them. I do.
Well, I don't know. It's good to question how inevitable.
Yeah, I think it's good to question their efficacy, particularly as places of public gathering, and who, you know, also who is gathering, and who really is the target of the inquiry of who should be in a museum space, and what those histories look like. But I was struck as you're talking, because what you're talking about in creating a new type of archive is, I think, very special, and I'm envious of your ability to do that. And I'm struck by how different systems based on geography and I think national policy are able to operate with more flexibility and freedom to create different types of archives. And I think a lot of that, so again, thinking about the US, our institutions are heavily biased because of our funding structure here, which is primarily reliant on private funding, which then turns into agendized funding, if we're going to be like really candid about it. And that tailors and shapes the types of histories that we see, the types of shows we see. And I think the silence of what we don't see here is really deafening, actually. And it's because we have a structure that is implicitly reliant on the like 0.01%.
Yeah.
Even though we pretend that these spaces are for publics without actually defining who those publics are. And I think in Europe, there are different structures of funding that perhaps lend themselves to less biased histories and exhibitions and platforms.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I totally get all that. And on some levels, yes and no, like things work until they don't, right? When you push at this kind of rigorous level. But I suppose that's the point. You start to become very tactical about what are the tools in your hands, and whether you can use them in this way for as long as you can, I think. And to that end, the network that is the Internationale, I don't know if everybody knows it, is a really important network. It's a network of museums, mid-scale European museums, so everything from Salt in Turkey to the Venaba, where I used to work, IMMA, Rena Sofia, Magba, and where else are we talking about? The Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana, because they're actually thinking in this tactical sort of collaborative way. And I would say are more politically savvy about the political importance of this kind of this iteration. So there is some hope out there, but not a lot.
What, could you say the name of the organization again?
Yeah, it's called leinternationale.org. And it's a good publishing platform, actually based out of Gothenburg as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie and Jasmine. I'll probably ask the last question for today, if we all have a little extra time to spare. Yeah? All right. Oh, Radhika, you need to head. All right. So I think let's then just wrap up the discussion.
You can continue. I just have to go now.
Thank you so much for joining us, Radhika. It's been such a lovely discussion, and and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I can stay for 5 more minutes and then I have to go.
For sure.
Same here for me. Let's do 5 minutes more.
All right, great. Okay. So my last question for today would be: in what ways does erasure operate, not only through absence but also through misrepresentation or token inclusion?
I don't know. How many hours do you have?
It's true.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
I wanted to add something to that, which is like this sort of implicit value that gets attributed to artworks that are in line with the market. And I think that's something that happens a lot in a European context, in ways that we don't talk about enough. That there's a real like discourse of complexity, formal complexity, conceptual complexity that functions as an exclusionary mechanism for people that are coming from aesthetic universes that have different values, and it becomes a justification for erasure and exclusion in
Same
ways
here.
that are.
Natasha?
And I think
Jasmine,
I was just going to say, I think you're absolutely right. The sort of conflation of the commodification of art and the art market really does begin to dictate not only what is shown and what is privileged, but also in a sort of strange way, what is tokenized to the point that it becomes simply a trend that later just vanishes and cripples, I think, particular markets and particular groups that are often groups of historically marginalized people.
I think to add to that, I mean, in Sri Lanka, we're sort of going through this explosive period of collectors, which seems to sort of dictate, as you all saying, what gets sold, and it sort of becomes quite voyeuristic in that sense, because you're sort of looking into something and presenting it as something sellable, really. But what's really interesting for me with this current trend that's happening here with the works that are produced is some of these works were really part of a public conversation. They're really a political engagement. And when they're sort of collected and they're taken out of the sphere that was meant to be part of this public discourse, as in they go into private collections and they're never seen again, you just see them in a catalogue after that. So that actually the raison d'etre of that work is gone, because there is no work for us to publicly engage with. And that is happening a lot in Sri Lanka. And occasionally they come out into for an exhibition, they're loaned or rented or whatever. And it just sort of, I don't know, it takes that political intent out of it, which really is happening right now, and you see it. And then there's this preference given, or there's this platform given to collectors and collecting, and that becomes it becomes a beast in itself that I think is I don't know, it's becoming a little bit counterproductive, let's say.
Radhika, it's so interesting that you mentioned this, because my entire master's thesis was on the work of Gordon Parks, and his images which he captured of the civil rights movement, and the whole idea that those photographs are now auctioned and they're hanging on top of someone's fireplace. So how does that context sort of change, and where does the work find sort of grounding? Sadya, I think you had a comment as well.
I'll quickly drop it and run away. Exactly what Radhika was saying. I think silence and the misinterpretation is consequential, and silence is giving the privilege of misinterpretation. Who is collecting, when is collecting, how they're presenting it. And certain portion of population is not bothered to talk about it because they don't think they belong to that privileged stage, or they will be anyway silenced. They have other security issue, other risks to their life. So this is very consequential. Like, silence creates the privilege for misinterpretation, and that is a loop. It just goes around and around.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have a comment?
So, Prerna, I'll just put my last comments, and I will talk about my works in the context that I work. So it's such a powerful question, to be honest, because erase doesn't always like come in form of silence. Sometimes it's just this misrepresentation is just like play a very important role, because the past few years of Republic that I work in Afghanistan on the women histories and women's life, to be honest, it was so crazy, because I just saw that how, in the context of Afghanistan, Iran, you see that how always women are erased, and their voice overlooked. And like our society erased women life, and it's such a patriarchal society. But the thing is that sometimes the Western media, the curators that I used to work, and the museums shows, the galleries. So that was also another kind of mispresentation, and just like bringing me into this very exotic boxes, you know. So that's also, I think, another kind of erasing, which I also mentioned it at the beginning that I talked. So I just wanted to talk about this. I found it such a powerful, because sometimes when some platforms give you the chance to present your work, it doesn't mean that it's important, or it doesn't mean that it presents you in the way that you have to be presented, you know. So that's kind of be another face of erasing someone and making this artist very exotic ways and stuff. Because in the recent years that I work in the Western context, I just saw that how the art market is also like influenced and impacted by the political issues, you know. Because the same residency that I had in Paris, after the conflict in Afghanistan, they just started promoting and bringing another narrative of saving the life of refugees into the Iranian life, and then to the Palestinian, and then to the Ukrainians, so, you know. So even in Paris photo that I remember that the first years of Republic collapsed, the sale of my books and my works were quite different from now, you know, that Afghanistan disappeared from media. So it sometimes touches my heart. Maybe it gave me another chance, to be honest, that I presented my works in another way, but in the real life, it touches my heart that how me as an artist, that I just want to be an artist, that these political issues impacted even the sale of my book, and even the misrepresenting, and how putting me in the box of being an exile refugee, or all these labels that I carry in all my life. So just wanted to mention that sometimes it's not just about erasing, and erase doesn't always mean the silence. Sometimes when in any kind of platform that they make you more exotic and misrepresent you, that's also another way of being erased.
Thank you so much, Fatima. Do we have any closing comments? I don't want to keep everyone waiting for any longer. I know everyone has been so generous with their time today, and it's been such an interesting conversation. So if you have any closing comments. Right, great. Thank you so much to our speakers today. It's been such a wonderful conversation and such a pleasure to have you all with us. And we'll surely stay connected. And thanks a lot to the audience as well. We'll be posting the recording of the panel discussion online, and we'll be sharing the link to all of y'all. So in case you'd like to keep it for your archives or to share it with your with anyone, then you can do that. Thank you so much, and wish you a lovely rest of the day wherever you're based in.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye.